Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. Dark Water. This ship holds a nightmare. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Siren's Fog. The Salty Siren, a bar more famous for brawls than brews, reeked of stale beer and desperation. Captain Ezra Thorne nursed a lukewarm whiskey, the ice cubes clinking like the ghosts of past mistakes in his glass. A weathered face, etched with the harsh lines of the sea, betrayed the haunted glint in his eyes. A shipwreck years ago still clung to him like a barnacle, a constant reminder of the life he couldn't save. Across the bar, a woman with an unruly mane of silver hair scribbled furiously in a leather-bound journal. Dr. Evelyn Wright, a renowned historian with a penchant for the fringes of maritime lore, was known for her eccentric theories and even more eccentric wardrobe. Tonight, she sported a moth-eaten tweed jacket and a scarf that resembled a pirate's captured flag, a skull and crossbones grinning maniacally in the dim light. Suddenly, Dr. Wright slammed her journal shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the tense silence. She strode towards Captain Thorne, her eyes sparkling with a manic glint. "Captain," she rasped, her voice laced with the grit of years spent poring over dusty scrolls. "I have a proposition that could change your life." Thorne raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Another lost city of gold, Doctor?" "Even better," she declared, unfurling a worn parchment map on the sticky bar top. "The wreck of the San Felipe, a Spanish galleon rumored to be overflowing with lost treasures." "The San Felipe," a legend whispered in smoky taverns across the Pacific Northwest, a ghost ship swallowed by the unforgiving sea centuries ago. Thorne eyed the map, his weathered hand hovering over the faded ink. Intrigue flickered in his eyes, battling with the ghosts of his past. "The location is precise," Dr. Wright pressed, her voice a husky whisper. "But the journey won't be for the faint of heart." Jack Lucky O'Malley, a wiry mechanic, nursing a beer a few stools down, snorted. Lucky, notorious for his gambling debts, and even more notorious for his non-existent luck, was always drawn to whispers of riches. "Treasure, huh? Sounds like my kind of trip." He slammed his mug down, leaving a ring of condensation on the already damp wood. Maya Singe, Thorne's stoic first mate, materialized from the shadows behind him. Her dark eyes narrowed at Dr. Wright, the sharp glint a warning. "Captain," she began, her voice a low rumble, "this map smells like trouble." Thorne sighed, the weight of past failures pressing down on him. He could picture Sarah, his lost first mate, her bright smile a stark contrast to the storm that claimed her life. Was this another chase for a phantom? Another chance to drown his guilt in the salty depths? But then, a chilling fog rolled into the harbor town, seemingly out of nowhere. It crept in like a spectral hand, swallowing the bustling docks in an eerie silence. The townsfolk scurried for cover, muttering about ill omens and restless spirits. Dr. Wright's eyes gleamed with a strange intensity. "The siren's call," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "The fog always precedes her." Thorne looked from the map to the unnatural fog, a shiver crawling down his spine. Redemption or a watery grave? The choice hung heavy in the salty air. Chapter 2. The Leviathans Embraced. The fog clung to the ship like a shroud, muffling the sound of the waves into an eerie silence. Days had passed since their hasty departure from the fog-choked harbor. Dr. Wright, her eyes alight with feverish excitement, spent her days hunched over the map, muttering about celestial alignments and forgotten nautical charts. Captain Thorne, his weathered face etched with a new kind of tension, kept a wary eye on the horizon. Maya, ever watchful, remained a silent sentinel by his side. Then, a cry pierced the oppressive silence. Jack, the ship's mechanic, tumbled onto the deck, his eyes wide with terror. "There, look," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger into the swirling mist. A colossal shape emerged from the fog, a skeletal behemoth that dwarfed their own vessel. Rotting wood creaked a mournful song, and tattered sails hung limp in the stagnant air. It was the Leviathan, the fabled wreck from Dr. Wright's map, a monument to the sea's relentless power. An unsettling stillness hung heavy over the derelict ship. No gulls circled its skeletal frame, no barnacles clung to its hull. It was as if very ocean held its breath, waiting. A cold dread snaked its way into Thorne's gut. This wasn't just any shipwreck. This was a tomb. Ignoring the prickling fear, Dr. Wright practically leaped onto the small skiff they brought along. "This is it, Captain," she exclaimed, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic creak of the oars. "The San Felipe reborn." With a heavy heart, Thorne followed, Maya and a reluctant Jack completing the crew. The closer they got, the stranger the Leviathan became. Grotesque symbols, resembling writhing tentacles, were carved into the rotting wood, their meaning lost to time, but sending shivers down their spines. A gaping maw, once a grand entrance, greeted them. The air inside was thick with the stench of decay and something more sinister, something metallic that tasted like fear on their tongues. Claustrophobic corridors, barely illuminated by flickering lanterns, snaked deeper into the belly of the beast. Every creak of the decaying timbers, every groan of the groaning ship, amplified Jack's already rampant paranoia. "Something's not right here," he muttered, clutching a rusty crowbar like a talisman. "This place is haunted, I tell ya." Thorne ignored him, his gaze drawn to a faded inscription etched above an arched doorway. It read in weathered Spanish, "Tesoro maldito," or "Cursed treasure." An icy chill swept through him. Dr. Wright, however, seemed oblivious, her eyes gleaming with a manic light as she deciphered another wall inscription. A sudden tremor shook the ship, throwing them off balance. Dust rained down from the decaying rafters, and the air hung thick with tension. Maya's hand instinctively flew to the hilt of her sword, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness. "This ship doesn't want us here," she growled, her voice low and dangerous. A low, guttural growl echoed through the oppressive silence, seemingly emanating from the very depths of the wreck. Jack whimpered, his crowbar clattering to the deck. In that moment, Captain Thorne knew they had crossed a line. The San Felipe held no ordinary treasure. It held a nightmare, one that had been waiting for them for centuries. They had walked into the belly of the beast, and the beast was hungry. Chapter 3: Whispers in the Dead of Night. The guttural growl hung the stagnant air, a chilling reminder of the unseen horror that lurked within the Leviathan. Captain Thorne cursed, fear gnawing at the edges of his stoicism. He knew they were trapped, not just by the decaying hull, but by their own insatiable curiosity. Dr. Wright, however, remained strangely undeterred. Her eyes gleamed with a feverish intensity, fueled by the inscription and the promise of untold riches. Their exploration led them deeper into the ship's decaying heart. Cobwebs draped the crumbling walls like ghostly shrouds, and the air grew thick with the stench of mildew and something else, a metallic tang that tasted like old blood. Maya, ever vigilant, kept a watchful eye on the flickering shadows that danced at the edge of their lantern light. Suddenly, Jack let out a startled yelp, pointing at a hidden compartment nestled within a rotting bulkhead. Inside, nestled amongst moldy clothes and rusted tools, lay a leather-bound journal. Its pages, yellowed with age and damp, held the final desperate scribblings of the San Felipe's captain. As Dr. Wright, driven by an insatiable hunger, deciphered the faded ink, a chilling tale unfolded. Greed had turned the crew against their captain, leading to a bloody mutiny. But their victory was short-lived. They awoke the next morning to an unnatural fog that choked the ship and silenced the very air. Then came the whispers, disembodied voices that echoed through the corridors, driving them mad with fear and paranoia. Finally, the captain described a nightmarish entity, summoned by their greed, that devoured their souls one by one. Cold sweat prickled Thorne's skin as Dr. Wright finished translating the final entry. The silence that followed was broken only by the frantic scribbling of her own pen in her ever-present notebook. Her obsession with the treasure seemed to have morphed into something darker, a manic hunger that bordered on madness. Nightfall descended upon the Leviathan, cloaking the ship in an even deeper darkness. The flickering lanterns cast grotesque shadows that danced on the decaying walls, playing tricks on their already frayed nerves. Strange noises, like the scratching of claws on metal and the muffled moans of unseen souls, began to echo through the corridors. Shadowy figures darted at the edge of their vision, only to vanish when they dared to look directly. Jack, his fear now a palpable presence, whimpered in the corner, clutching his crowbar like a lifeline. Maya's stoicism began to crack, as even her unwavering loyalty to Captain Thorne couldn't hold back the growing sense of dread. Distrust settled like a thick fog between them. Each creak of the ship, each whisper in the dark, fueled their paranoia. Thorne watched Dr. Wright with a growing sense of unease. Was it just the darkness, or were her eyes glowing with an unnatural light? Was it his imagination, or did her smile hold a hint of something sinister? Sleep became a distant memory. The whispers intensified, growing clearer, more menacing. They spoke of greed, of betrayal, of a darkness that thirsted for vengeance. In the dead of night, Captain Thorne knew they weren't just fighting the horrors that lurked within the Leviathan. They were battling the darkness that had begun to consume them from within. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Past. Exhaustion gnawed at Captain Thorne, but sleep remained a distant fantasy. The spectral whispers echoed through his dreams, gnawing at his sanity and dredging up the ghosts he'd spent years trying to bury. He retreated to his cabin, the familiar creak of the ship a constant lullaby of despair. As he sank into his worn armchair, a glint of metal caught his eye. Tucked away in a forgotten corner of the cabin, half hidden by a frayed curtain, was a small wooden chest. Curiosity sparked a flicker of life in his weary eyes. The lock had rusted shut, but with a determined grunt, he forced it open. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay a weathered locket. A single, faded photograph peered back at him. A woman with windswept hair and eyes that held the sparkling defiance of the sea looked up at him, Sarah, his first mate, lost in a storm years ago. A sob escaped his lips, raw and guttural, the locket feeling heavy with unspoken grief. Flashbacks flooded his mind, vivid and brutal. The relentless storm, the battering waves, the desperate scramble for survival. He saw Sarah, her face etched with fear and determination, her voice a beacon of hope amidst the chaos. Then, the monstrous wave, a wall of water that swallowed her whole. The weight of his failure pressed down on him, crushing his spirit. He hadn't been able to save her. He, the seasoned captain, had lived, while she, with her boundless potential and infectious zest for life, was lost to the unforgiving sea. A cold draft swept through the cabin, snuffing out the lantern and plunging him into darkness. A disembodied voice, filled with a chilling sorrow, echoed in his ear. "Captain," it whispered, a voice that sounded suspiciously like Sarah. "Why did you let me drown?" Thorn whirled around, his heart hammering in his chest. In the flickering moonlight filtering through the grime-coated window, a spectral figure materialized. Sarah, translucent and ethereal, stood before him, her eyes filled with an endless sadness. "It's not your fault," she whispered, her voice barely a breeze. "We were all victims of the storm." But Thorn wasn't convinced. The whispers, the spectral apparition, it all felt like a cruel torment, a manifestation of his guilt. Was he losing his mind? Was this a trick of the shadows, a product of his sleep-deprived state? "Leave me alone," he growled, his voice thick with despair. The apparition wavered for a moment, then began to fade. "You deserve better than this," Sarah whispered one last time before dissolving into wisps of ghostly mist. Alone in the darkness, Thorn sank to his knees, the weight of his past threatening to consume him. He was a captain adrift, lost in a sea of self-doubt and crippling guilt. Was he leading them all to their doom, or was this another trick of the nightmare they had become entangled in? A renewed wave of whispers washed over him, speaking of betrayal, of vengeance, of a darkness waiting to be unleashed. The line between reality and his haunted memories blurred. The crew, Dr. Wright's growing obsession, the whispers in the dark, it all felt like a cruel twist of fate, a punishment for his past sins. Thorn knew he needed to regain control, not just of the ship, but of his own sanity. He had to find a way to break the curse of the Leviathan and the one that gnawed at his soul. But how? Sarah's spectral form flickered faintly in his mind. "You deserve better." Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to face his demons, for his own sake and the sake of those who still depended on him. Chapter 5. The Engine's Fury. Captain Thorn emerged from his cabin, a newfound resolve etched on his weathered face. He needed a plan, a way to navigate the treacherous waters within the Leviathan and the rising tide of paranoia infecting his crew. His steps echoed down the decaying corridors, leading him towards the rhythmic thrumming of the ship's engine. As he rounded a corner, a deafening clang resonated through the metal hull, followed by a string of furious curses. Jack, his face contorted in a mixture of terror and desperation, was hacking away at the engine's intricate machinery with a rusty wrench. Maya, her hand hovering near the hilt of her sword, was locked in a desperate struggle to stop him. "What in blazes are you doing, Jack?" Thorn bellowed, his voice cutting through the cacophony. Jack whirled around, his eyes wild with a manic glint. "This ship is cursed, Captain. This whole damn voyage is a recipe for disaster." He swung the wrench with renewed fervor, sparks flying as it connected with metal. Maya, her voice laced with barely contained anger, snapped, "Stop it, you fool. You'll get us all killed." Jack ignored her, his paranoid rant continuing. "This treasure is nothing but bad luck. It's a trap, I tell you. We need to turn this ship around before it's too late." Thorn understood Jack's fear. The whispers, the apparitions, the oppressive atmosphere of the ship, it was enough to break anyone. But destroying the engine wouldn't save them. It would strand them in the middle of nowhere, prey to the elements and whatever horrors lurked within the Leviathan. "Enough!" Thorn roared, his voice tinged with desperation. He shoved Maya aside and grabbed Jack's arm, the wrench clattering to the metal deck. A primal struggle ensued, a captain grappling with a mechanic consumed by fear. In the end, Captain Thorn's weathered strength prevailed, pinning Jack to the ground. Jack, his face contorted in rage, spat at Thorn, his voice laced with a chilling desperation. "You'll regret this, Captain. You'll all regret it. This ship will be our tomb." Thorne stared down at his struggling crewmate, a deep sense of despair washing over him. Jack's outburst mirrored the growing unease within them all. The lines between reality and delusion were blurring. Were they being haunted by a malevolent entity, or were the whispers simply a manifestation of their own deepest fears? As they restrained Jack, his screams echoing through the metal hull, Maya met Thorne's gaze. Her usual stoicism had fractured, replaced by a raw vulnerability that mirrored his own. They were all teetering on the edge, clinging to their sanity by a thread. "What now, Captain?" she rasped, her voice laced with exhaustion. Thorne looked around at the engine room, the rhythmic thrumming now a mocking counterpoint to the chaos within. He knew they couldn't stay on this course, blindly. They needed answers, a way to break the curse of the Leviathan before it consumed them all. He straightened his shoulders, a flicker of determination returning to his eyes. "We keep going," he declared, his voice hoarse but firm. "We find the treasure, whatever it may be, and then we get the hell out of here." A flicker of hope ignited in Maya's eyes, a silent agreement. Jack's outburst had served as a stark reminder of the consequences of inaction. Their descent into madness could only be halted by facing their fears and uncovering the secrets the ship held. With a heavy heart, Thorne ordered Maya to secure Jack. They would press on, deeper, into the belly of the beast, hoping against hope that salvation awaited them at the end of this nightmarish journey. Chapter 6. The Cage of Whispers. The air grew thick with a metallic tang as they descended deeper into the Leviathan's bowels. Every creak of the decaying timbers, every groan of the groaning ship, felt amplified by the oppressive silence. Maya, her grip tight on the hilt of her sword, led the way, her eyes scanning the shadowed corners for any sign of danger. Jack, subdued but still muttering under his breath, was secured between Captain Thorne and Dr. Wright. Dr. Wright, her eyes gleaming with an almost feverish intensity, deciphered cryptic symbols carved into the damp walls. "The treasure hold," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. "It's just ahead." A heavy iron door, emblazoned with a grotesque skull and crossed bones, stood at the end of the passage. It groaned open with a rusty screech, revealing a cavernous chamber bathed in an unnatural, sickly green glow. In the center, a massive cage made of iron bars pulsed with an ominous light. Inside, a swirling mass of inky darkness writhed and churned, sending tendrils of shadow that danced across the chamber walls. A collective gasp escaped their lips. This wasn't a chest overflowing with gold. The whispers that had plagued them, the apparitions that haunted their dreams, it all stemmed from this entity, this pulsating heart of darkness. The caged entity seemed to sense their presence. It lashed out, its inky tendrils lashing against the bars, the metal groaning in protest. Grotesque, shadowy figures coalesced from the darkness, their mouths agape in silent screams. Jack whimpered, his bravado dissolving into raw terror. Maya, her voice low and dangerous, gripped her sword tighter. "We need to get out of here," she growled. But Dr. Wright, her eyes fixated on the pulsating darkness, seemed oblivious. Her lips moved silently as she deciphered an inscription etched on the cage. "The key," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the guttural growls of the entity. The key to unlocking its power. A cold dread washed over Captain Thorne. Dr. Wright's obsession had morphed into something far more sinister. She wasn't interested in escaping the curse. She wanted to exploit it. "Dr. Wright, are you insane?" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the chamber. "This thing is evil. We need to destroy it." Dr. Wright turned to him, a manic glint in her eyes. "Destroy it?" "No, Captain. We control it." With its power, we can be unstoppable." Her words hung heavy in the air, a chilling revelation. Their journey wasn't just about treasure. It was about unleashing an unimaginable evil upon the world. The whispers hadn't been a curse. They'd been a seduction, a slow manipulation by the entity to find a willing vessel. A realization dawned on Thorn. Jack's paranoia, Maya's growing fear, even his own haunted past, the entity had been feeding on their vulnerabilities, driving them all to the brink. This wasn't just a physical battle. It was a fight for their very souls. The entity pulsed with renewed energy, the cage straining against its dark power. Thorn knew they were running out of time. He had to stop Dr. Wright, even if it meant using force. A desperate plan began to take shape in his mind. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting the world from the nightmare they had unwittingly unleashed. Chapter 7. Desperate Escape. A primal scream ripped through the treasure hold, shattering the chilling silence. Dr. Wright, her eyes wide with manic fervor, lunged for the inscription on the cage, her outstretched hand trembling with anticipation. Captain Thorn reacted with the ferocity of a cornered animal. He shoved her aside, his weathered body a surprisingly sturdy barrier. "Get away from there!" he roared, his voice laced with a desperate urgency. A deafening clang echoed through the chamber as the entity slammed its shadowy form against the cage bars. Grotesque apparitions materialized from the inky tendrils, their forms shifting and morphing to resemble their deepest fears. A monstrous serpent with glowing red eyes, a spectral figure with Sarah's face, a skeletal hand reaching from the shadows, the entity twisted their nightmares into reality. Jack, his sanity hanging by a thread, cowered in the corner, whimpering incoherently. Maya, ever the pragmatist, sprang into action. With a practiced flick of her wrist, her sword sliced through one of the shadowy figures, only for it to reform moments later. "We can't fight them all," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of growls and screams. Thorn knew she was right. They needed to escape. But how? The iron door that led to the treasure hold groaned shut with a finality that sent shivers down his spine. They were trapped. Dr. Wright, momentarily stunned by Thorn's intervention, let out a shriek of frustration, but her obsession quickly reignited. "We can still use the ventilation shaft," she screeched, darting toward the rusty grate in the corner. "It leads to the upper decks." Thorn hesitated. Could he trust her? But they had no other choice. With a wary glance at the caged entity, which pulsated with a renewed intensity, he followed Maya and Dr. Wright through the narrow shaft. Claustrophobia gnawed at Thorn as they crawled through the cramped passage. The stench of stale air and mildew filled his nostrils, and every creak of the decaying ship sent jolts of adrenaline through him. Finally, they emerged onto a deserted deck, moonlight filtering through the grime-coated skylight. But the respite was short-lived. The entity's influence seemed to permeate the entire ship. Nightmarish apparitions materialized on the deck, blocking their path. Jack, his fear reaching a breaking point, screamed and charged at one of the figures, only to be engulfed by a shadowy tendril. His muffled screams echoed through the dead air before abruptly stopping. A wave of nausea washed over Thorn. Jack's fate hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the consequences of their choices. He gritted his teeth, gripping his makeshift weapon, a rusty crowbar scavenged from the engine room. "We need to get to the lifeboats," Maya growled, her voice laced with a quiet determination. "There might be a chance we can outrun this thing." Thorn nodded, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. They fought their way through the nightmarish gauntlet, each blow against the shadowy figures a desperate act of defiance. Dr. Wright, however, seemed strangely unaffected by the terror around her. Her eyes gleamed with a predatory hunger as she scanned the deck. "Look!" she shrieked, pointing toward the hidden hatchway. "The captain's quarters. The key to the cage must be there." Before Thorn or Maya could react, she had disappeared down the hatch. A cold dread settled in Thorn's stomach. Dr. Wright's thirst for power had become an even greater threat than the entity itself. He knew he had to stop her, not just for his own survival, but for the sake of the world. With a final surge of adrenaline, Thorn and Maya reached the lifeboats. The rickety wooden vessels creaked ominously in the moonlight, but they offered a sliver of hope. As they scrambled aboard, a horrifying realization dawned on Thorn. There were only 2 lifeboats. Chapter 8: The Price of Survival. The icy spray lashed against Captain Thorn's face as he surveyed the scene. The Leviathan, once a colossal wreck, now lay broken in half, its innards spewing forth a grotesque stew of rotting wood and churning darkness. Maya stood beside him, her face etched with a grim determination that mirrored his own. There was only 1 lifeboat left, a fragile wooden vessel barely big enough for 2. Dr. Wright was nowhere to be seen. Whether she had perished in the final collapse of the ship or managed to escape with the key to the cage, Thorn couldn't say. But one thing was certain: they couldn't let the entity win. As if sensing their defiance, a colossal, shadowy tendril erupted from the wreckage. It swirled with a malevolent light, coalescing into the most terrifying manifestation, yet a monstrous amalgamation of all their nightmares. Sarah's sorrowful face contorted in a silent scream, Jack's skeletal hand grasping at them from the inky depths, the grotesque captain from Dr. Wright's journal leering with malice. Fear threatened to consume them, but Thorn held firm. He remembered Sarah's spectral words, "You deserve better." This wasn't just about survival. It was about facing their demons and protecting the world from this malevolent entity. "Maya," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "there's only one chance. We need to sever the source of its power." Her eyes narrowed in understanding. The cage. They launched themselves back onto the crumbling deck, the groaning timbers protesting with every step. The entity's tendrils lashed out, the air thick with the stench of decay and despair. Maya, her movements, honed by years of combat, danced around the shadowy appendages, her sword flashing in the dying moonlight. Thorn, his heart pounding in his chest, reached the hatch leading to the captain's quarters. The door hung precariously on its hinges, ripped free by the ship's final throes. Inside, a lone chest sat amidst the wreckage. Hope flickered in his eyes, the key. But as he reached for it, a chilling cackle echoed through the chamber. Dr. Wright, her eyes burning with a now familiar manic glint, stood between him and the chest. In her hand, she clutched a rusted key, a cruel smile twisting her lips. "This power is mine, Captain," she shrieked, her voice laced with a newfound arrogance. "With it, I will be unstoppable." Thorn stared at her, his heart sinking. The treasure they had sought wasn't gold. It was the key to unleashing a nightmare upon the world. He understood now. Dr. Wright hadn't been corrupted by the entity. She had always been susceptible to its allure. A desperate plan formed in his mind. He lunged forward, not for the chest, but for Dr. Wright. They grappled in the wreckage, a struggle for control, for sanity itself. A sickening crack echoed through the chamber as Dr. Wright's foot slipped, sending her tumbling backwards. She landed with a scream, the key clattering from her grasp and rolling towards the open hatch. Below, the churning darkness of the ocean beckoned. Thorn stared down at her, his weathered face etched with a mixture of sadness and resolve. This wasn't the ending he had envisioned, but it was the only one left. The key to the cage, and Dr. Wright's dreams of power plunged into the abyss. A deafening roar erupted from the wreckage as the entity convulsed. Its shadowy form thrashed and contorted, its tendrils flailing in a final display of defiance. Then, with a sickening crack, a blinding light engulfed the ship. Thorn shielded his eyes, expecting the worst. But when he opened them again, the entity was gone. Only the churning wreckage remained, a testament to the horrors they had faced. He stumbled back to the deck, finding Maya waiting for him, her face a mask of exhaustion. Without a word, they climbed into the lifeboat, pushing away from the dissolving wreckage. As the sun began to rise, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and gold, they drifted aimlessly, the taste of salt water and survival clinging to their tongues. Had they truly escaped the nightmare? Thorn didn't know. The whispers, the apparitions, they seemed like a distant memory, yet a part of them lingered, a chilling reminder of the darkness they had faced. One thing was certain: they were forever changed. They had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. They had paid the price of survival, and the weight of that price would forever rest on their shoulders.